Greetings, fellow travelers, and welcome to The Way of the Showman, where we view the world through the lens of showmanship. I am Captain Frodo, and I will be your gracious host and guide along the way. Now, last week we spoke about, well, it wasn't actually last week, but last episode, we spoke about the little candle, about finding your calling, how to find our calling, and that sparked in me that a few weeks ago when I was in Stockholm rehearsing the Reflex show with Jay Gilligan, on the day that I was leaving, I also met for the first time in real life Eric Orberg. And when Jay then was talking to him, and we were talking sort of together, and Jay said, well, what are you working on? Sort of, what project are you working on? And then we got into this conversation about exactly this. How do we end up doing the exact things that we end up doing? Why is it that juggling and juggling history, or circus, the history of circus, interests us? And why is it that it interests Eric Orberg in particular? And why is it that it interests me as well? And although that conversation, I'm not trying to encapsulate the contents of that, because that was an extraordinary thing in itself. And I had recorded the episode that you heard last episode, but we hardly got to scratch the surface of that. But yeah, it was just incredible to hear, completely out of the blue, not because of an episode that I had done or whatever, somebody else bringing up something, and I'm going, I can't believe it. I have an episode coming out exactly about this. Of course, how one finds one's calling, I'm aware that the last episode is almost like poetic, but and that's why I'm using imagery and stuff. I'm talking about music, and I'm talking about a little candle and a flame that becomes the pilot light to seek a greater fire for us to connect to something bigger. Perhaps that whole thing there is just connected to us being human beings and being ultimately a super social species. We need others, and we need to feel like we belong together, just like my tiny little dog just feels like as long as all the family is together, then all is well, and then we can just relax, eat the meatballs in our bowl, and hang out and sleep on the couch, and life is good. Maybe that is what it's tapping into, this thing of connecting to something greater, finding meaning beyond the immediate thing. But getting back to how one finds one's calling, we have to talk to it, because language, and exactly why I end up with juggling and not something else, why he also ended up with juggling and he went into other things and I went into other things, as in Eric Orberg and in Jay and in you as well. How did you end up with exactly that thing? And I think, like I said in that essay, the closest I can get is there are certain things in us that finds things in the world, and when you encounter those things, then you're exposed to them, then they grab onto you and you feel good for having found them, and then that sets you on this path and a journey. And one of the things that he was also pointing out was that at some point in life we find ourselves being so far down along one way that it's any other way that we decide to start, we end up right at the very beginning, and in the very beginning most things lack depth. And if there's anything that this podcast is about, it's about going deep. It's about asking all of those questions that we have not dared to ask, or have not been insane enough to have thought about, or whatever. So this podcast is about finding depth where we are, those of us who find ourselves along the way of the showman, who have already gone to circus school, who have already been doing shows for so long that when the pandemic hit, we can't easily go into something else or go back to the beginning. Not just because we will be right back at the beginning of something, but also because we love this way that we're at. And it's beautiful to know that other people out there too asks these great big questions, going, why did I end up here? So, last week's episode did end with me talking a little bit about how, we want to connect to something deeper and something greater. And that kind of ended that whole, we talked about the Roman genius and how that is one slightly different from the genius that we have, like that it could also be a place that has a certain thing. And then we talked about Brian Eno and seniors, and we talked about inspiration and enthusiasm, of how enthusiasm has sort of divine roots, and that genius, enthusiasm, inspiration to be breathed into, like God breathing light into, no, not light, well, that too, it's like breathing life into Adam in Michelangelo's painting and all that. So that was the gist of the last episode. So with that said, we're gonna jump straight into the next section, and we've sort of reached a bit of a threshold after I did the 2 episodes of anatomy, the anatomy of the show, which is on a very concrete kind of level with the material, character and structure. And as I explored with Eric and Jay the other day at the airport, you can actually then break the material apart too into a whole another world. Maybe triangles, maybe dodecahedrons. I don't know what exists, but it can still, everything can be continually divided into further things. But anyway, after having gone through that and then done the anatomy of showmanship, is how we relate to the audience and everything, we're now going to, that's like the structure of our show reality and the reality of showmanship as I see it, and those are the maps that we will continue to explore. And now we will delve further into each of those 4 elements of showmanship. We will look at showman, audience and attention and show in each in turn, and as we do so we will get greater insight, and this will take quite a few episodes to go through. We will start by looking at the showman, which is the first point, as those who remember from the geometry of showmanship episode. That's kind of like the first point, because that's the point that we are in, and this triangle is in a sense starting with us and sprouting out in 2 lines from us, one going to the audience and the other one going up to the show, and we're connected again on the other side like that. We spoke about that. So we're going to look at so there's many different threads that we will pick up now that will be related to these. So we're basically looking in depth at what we talked about in the anatomy of showmanship, and see what glorious treasures of insights we will find along the way. Thanks for coming along with me on this next exciting leg of the journey. Oh yeah, and you can find me on Frodo Santini on Facebook. You can find me on Frodo Santini on Instagram. Drop me a message or something, and if you want to buy me a coffee, then you can do that at buymeacoffee.com/Captain Frodo. Let's get on with the show. The 4 elements of showmanship in depth. And I would like to take a more detailed look at each of these 3 constituents and at the glue of attention, which ties it all together. We will look at the showman, at the audience, at shows, and attention, each in turn in a more encompassing way than we've done so far. By now, we have an idea of how the 4 pillars of showmanship interacts in a process. We know that it is a process, so we hardly need reminding that each of these elements are only discrete identities or phenomena, because that's how we've drawn them up on our maps. They are, of course, completely always, they're just so interlinked that they constantly bleed over into each other. Each element in the fire can, at least for the most part, only be properly separated by abstraction. The process of showmanship is a whole, always an organic whole, containing the elements so that one can find them when looking for them, but they are no more separate from the process of showmanship than thoughts, will, or feelings are separated from ourselves as whole individuals. So the first thing that we are going to look at is the showman. Who is the showman? And of course we're now talking on the greater scale. So for a starter, before we dig into it further, I must say that the showman is me. I am the showman. The way of the showman is ultimately my way. When it comes down to it, that's all I have to offer the world, myself and the world as I see it from my particular point of view. I am just like anyone. I have walked with the crowd, but then turned around to face the others. And what I have to show them is the sum of what I have seen and participated in, digested in my inner machinery, and then synthesized and presented back to the world in my shows and in these podcasts. As the world laughs at me, they are also laughing at themselves, but mostly of me. So, let's start looking at uniqueness. Being unique. It might seem like hubris to think that you are unique. You might quote the old adage, "I am unique," screamed the snowflake. You could scream that to crush my dream of uniqueness. And I would see your point. But even in the case of the snowflake, which has so little will or ability to cause change or to influence other snowflakes or any other events, the uniqueness is not necessarily irrelevant. Even as an unconscious collection of water particles, it can cause change in the world. If we consider chaos theory and how chaotic systems have such sensitive dependence on initial conditions, most famously illustrated with a butterfly flapping its wings and the tiny ensuing perturbations triggering a sequence of events leading to a storm, perhaps even a snowflake can make a difference. And just yesterday, it snowed in Norway. I wrote this I wrote it, and this actually happened in December 2020, but I'm telling it now, and we've just already had the first days of frost here, so maybe this day will come again. But this day, when it snowed, this yesterday that I talk of today, then it was the first sledding day of the winter, and I was out with my daughter, going hell for leather down a steep hill. And we were walking back up the hill when it started to snow. And I didn't think much of it then, but all of a sudden she screamed behind me, and I jolted and snapped around to see whether she'd been attacked by wolves or fallen into some glacier crevasse. But as it turned out, and when I turned around, I saw that the slowly falling snowflakes were backed by the light through the clouds, and she was studying the falling flakes, and she was screaming because she had pinpointed one flake, and it was closing in, and I turned just in time to see that one flake landing on the tip of her nose. For all I know, that was the snowflake from the adage that only moments before was screaming of its uniqueness. And this was a moment of significant timing, as my friend Trent Bauman says. We, my daughter and I, shared in a precious moment of synchronicity of a falling frozen water crystal meeting a tiny cold nose in her first proper Norwegian winter with minus 11 degrees centigrade. And it might sound like something that I made up to make a point for this podcast, but it isn't. That snowflake made a difference, a positive difference to the world, my world. As far as I know, that was the first time my little girl experienced that feeling. And that was a part of my childhood that now was a part of hers too. The snowflake had made a tiny connection. It influenced both my daughter and I, and we both felt better for it, and we laughed out loud. And I want to say that we laughed out loud, actually. And I want to say that the joy made us just throw our arms around each other in astonishment over the immense beauty of the universe. But that would be pushing the truth. But we did laugh out loud, though. And sometimes that's enough. So this next bit is sort of under the heading of the calling to connect. So ultimately, I really think that this whole enterprise of showmanship, and beyond that, the whole enterprise of existence is about connections. It's about relationships. And in Ian McGilchrist's new book, The Matter with Things, he has this incredible statement or point that he develops at great length of that the relationships are more primary than the relata. And the relata is just the things that are the things, like the actual relationship between everything in the universe on the subatomic level to us, to the planets going at that. That's actually prior to the actual things, that it's about that. So anyway, for those of you who are interested in that, can pursue that in that 2-volumed tome. So the illuminated showman walked with the crowd, then turned around to face the others. In this bit of the manifesto, we find the snowflake question about uniqueness explained. A showman was one of the crowd, but then something made him want to express something, so he turned around to face the others. Along the way of life, something triggered him, a moment of stillness and a sudden rustle of the leaves, a deep experience of a song, a poem, a feeling of despair, boredom, or deep, passionate love. Something opened the world up to a different, larger conversation. And this spark became a calling, a call from the wild, the greater, beyond the mundane. Something compelled him to share something from inside him about the world. And I believe that to share is deeply intertwined with connecting. To really share is about connection. This is, in a very deep way, the very core of what illuminated showmanship is about. Connection. In many ways, mine or anyone's uniqueness is not much to speak of. But the great conglomeration of experiences, influences, the sum of thoughts, feelings, the songs you sang and the dances you danced, all adds up to one special individual. Everything has been done. Everything has been done except for your life. This you are doing on your own. Of this, you are the protagonist. Some stories are tragic, some heroic, and some comedic. And this is why you yourself is as unique a starting point as you'll ever find. And once you are gone, there will be a hole in the universe with your shape. That will not be exactly filled when you leave. This might not matter in the grand scope of things, but it matters to you, and that is the starting point you need. You are the beginning of everything. This is even more true for artists, for we have an extraordinary will and desire to give good ideas, feeling, concrete, outer representation. Our souls reside in the conversational space of reality, the area of interest, where we both explore the world and through this exploration finds fuel for expressing it, refined for others to experience. To share with others, and thus create and facilitate connections of a myriad, like on a myriad of levels, in the endless interconnected web of life and culture. Like that's where it's at for us. The things I think, feel, and do as a free agent in the world are not all that different from the ideas, emotions, and desires of others. My combinations of these, though, is a unique starting point for connections. The fact that the things I feel and think and desire are the same as others means that there is a possibility for genuine connection. All I have to offer is the way the world looks from my point of view. I said the showman was me, but in truth, the showman is you as well. The showman, the show human, is you. The showman is every single one of us. So yeah, before we get lost in explorations of great philosophical and existential importance, let's just try and narrow the spotlight of this and try to define what a showman is for us in our project, and also what is it in just common usage. We've sort of talked about this a little bit before, but we'll look at it again here. Because as it turns out, they're not all that different. A showman is someone who does shows. It's someone who shows something to others. One who has something to show when he gets the attention, and a showman is a doer. This active characteristic makes him more like a verb than a noun, a process and not a thing. Something that happens, not just something that is. And by these criteria we end up with a wider scope than the dictionary definitions. And we'll look at them again here now. We looked at them before, but we'll look at them in a bit. Our criteria encompasses all types of artists, but also a few professions which would not immediately be thought of as showfolk, like teachers. A teacher is a kind of showman, or show human. A painter is a showman, and a preacher and a writer is also, when you look at it in a certain way, they're also showmen, showfolk. A writer writes their novel to show to others. The painter paints to show man, and reveal the pulsing meat of human experience, be it in abstract or in realistic depictions of human beings or things. The medium of transmitting the material is substantially different for painters and writers, as their paintings and books are material objects in the world, not just temporal experiences like dance, theatre, and acrobatic hand-balancing acts. We spoke about this in the process chapter. Well, the process episode. Foundations, flowing foundations of showmanship, that episode. The teacher is, as far as I see it, a showman in every sense. Their format is slightly different, with more emphasis on learning than entertainment, more emphasis on changing content every day. But, as we all know, a good teacher balances keeping the students' attention by engaging them and disseminating the curriculum. There is a kind of entertaining flow of material that can be achieved even in when you're teaching history or mathematics. Just remember the geometry of showmanship lecture. That was probably a pinnacle of entertainment for some of you anyway. There are different requirements for the specificity of the messages that a teacher teaches and the material that's conveyed than in a circus show or whatever. But if you keep a certain openness in the way that you think about these categorizations, you will see what I mean. So what are the dictionary definitions on showman? And we also look at entertainer and performer. So a showman is a person who produces or presents shows as a profession, especially the proprietor, manager, or MC of a circus, fair, or other variety show. Now, we've already decided that whether you're making a living or money from your showmanship, it makes no real difference. Money is often an important part of the equation, but it is not one of the essentials of our definition of showmanship. And the word showman entered the English language somewhere between 1725 and 1735. Apart from the definition above, a showman can also mean a proprietor or a manager of a circus or a fair or a carnival or cabaret or variety show. And this is absolutely true. And there are many great examples of this from the rich history of showmanship. My credentials in writing all of this is my lived experience as a performer. So for me, the definition most fitting is perhaps from the Google dictionary, that showman is someone skilled and practiced in dramatic and entertaining presentations, performances, or any kind of public displays. But as we explore these definitions of showman, we find that they are largely synonymous with both performer and entertainer. As an entertainer is a person, such as a singer, a dancer or comedian whose job it is to entertain others. I mean, that thing is just circular, so it's like an entertainer is somebody who entertains. So we will look in depth at what the difference is between art and entertainment in a later episode, and in 2 later episodes perhaps even. And the word entertainer came into use in 1530, so it precedes showman by a couple of 100 years. And a performer is a person who acts, sings, or does other entertainment in front of audiences. A performer is a person who acts, sings, or does other entertainment in front of audiences. I haven't written exactly which of these quotes come from which dictionary or whatever, but it's because they aren't sort of fully relevant, important in themselves for where they came from, and because we've moved beyond this anyway. Etymologically, the word performer came into the English language from French around 1300. At the time it meant one who accomplishes or fulfills something, like he performed the act of building a table. The meaning that's more sort of pertinent for our explorations as someone who takes part in public entertainment, that came like 200-300 years or so later. And consistent in both of these meanings, though, are what we sort of talked about before. It's a kind of activity. It's a sort of doing of something. So, what is a showman from our point of view? Well, a showman is something more than these definitions. With all these definitions, we see the showman as singular, and I get the feeling that he's just an individual, in these descriptions. An individual that's cracking jokes for cash, making people have a good time, and all these definitions describes the showman, performer, or entertainer as a single individual, but we must not forget that he is part of a duality. A duality not normally of just 2 individuals, but a duality between one facing a group of people and an audience. The audience completes the showman. This duality, showman-audience, is how showman is a part of the world and how the showman is connected to everyone. Without an audience, he is that man, with peculiar and useless skills whom the definitions describe. It is the audience which makes his skills practical, and who gives his vocation meaning, and who places him into the greater context of the world. So what I'm saying is that in a very real way, the audience and showman are one thing, or as we have already spoken about, there are not really things as such. They're a process, like in the way that a photon of light is both a wave and a particle, and in how the logs and the igniter stacked in the right way creates the fire, stacked in the right way and lit. So the 2, showman and audience, can be talked about separately, but are in a certain sense one. And to study them as 2 makes certain sense, but unless these findings or details are then placed back into a whole, it will not make the full kind of sense. And to understand the showman, we need to consider him not on his own, but as someone or something in a constant relation to an audience, like Einstein's space-time. Not space and time, but space-time, as in 2 aspects of a one part of reality. What we get from this way of understanding the showman turns out to have the deepest possible existential implications, and it trips me into talking about meaning in life, and is an enormous subject, of course, I've talked about before, but and I'm saying meaning in life because I don't know if it is the meaning of life, but The view that the showman isn't an isolated individual but an intrinsic part of a process is to me a key philosophical insight which directly impacts on me and my understanding of myself in the world. It shows me that the showman isn't just a presenter of novelties and cheap tricks to pass the time in a pleasant manner before we all face the final curtain. This interconnectedness offers one little facet of an answer to the question of meaning in life. There are many things which gives meaning in life, and this is why I say my understanding of showman, audience, or showman world interconnectedness is only a facet. I believe meaning is an ongoing relational thing. It is like any practice, like meditation or the mastery of a craft such as performing. It is an ongoing process and not something you learn and then have mastered. Yet interconnectedness, the feeling that you are connected to something larger than yourself, and knowing that you matter to this larger self, is a powerful experience. It is rooted in our desire to belong, I think. And these are deep-seated desires for us who are a supersocial species, as I mentioned before. Our biology and psychology have just merged there. And there might be true outsiders out there, but speaking in broad terms, I think this is a universal human trait. To feel like we are part of something larger than ourselves is one of the things which reliably gives meaning for human beings. We are in every respect social beings. To feel that we are not just single individuals scrambling alone in the darkness of existence gives us great comfort. And to know that we instead are a tribe of individuals scrambling together in the darkness of existence makes the situation more bearable. There are so many aspects of what makes life meaningful, but as I see it, there are two lines of meaning that can be found and felt through fully taking in and taking on the showman's deep interconnectedness with the audience. Along the way, through life, we need to find both a personal meaning and also a relational meaning. We need to feel like we are understood, that the world, our family, our audiences can make sense of us. Part of this comes from getting in touch with ourselves, knowing ourselves enough to know what we want to do in the world. You know, we talked about that in the episode about the little candle and that. Because performing and creating, learning to play music, reading and writing, taking in ideas and then the considered expressions, be it art, music, science, journalism or what have you, and then letting them live in me and finding ways to transform and reflect certain of those back into the world to my audiences, that makes me happy. I spoke about this in the very first transmissions from inner space I think maybe in the introductory episode or something. But this feeling of rightness, that is a blessing. I have found my expression and thus my place in the world. Having found my place and what feels meaningful to me to be doing with the time that I have is an important step towards my personal meaning. With the insight that our audience is more than just people to whom we casually show a few tricks, that the role we play, or the piece of the world organism we are, is symbiotically connected to other human beings. Our audience, this goes a long way for me to discover relational meaning. My interactions and my contributions to the world organism affords me a meaningful relationship and belonging in the world. And I find that with this realization that my interactions with my audiences and contributions shape my understanding of what I do, it makes me hold myself accountable for my interactions and contributions. I want to strive to make my actions worthy of this role that I have assumed and worthy of asking for my audience's attention. We'll talk more about this when we get to talking about the showman's obligation, and when I talk about having a reverent attitude towards the audience. So another aspect to consider when meaning in life is the realization of one's own insignificance in the grand scope of existence. not to wallow in our unimportance, but to see that even though each one of us is tiny and only temporarily on this earth, we can choose to take action towards outcomes that go beyond our own life, needs and comforts, desires, gains and losses. We can make a positive difference. Not huge, but still. This just reminds me of this story. I don't know where I heard it first, but it's kind of cute. It's like there's a girl on a beach after a storm, and the storm has washed thousands of jellyfish up onto the sand. And she's walking with her dad, and then she sees this, and she begins throwing them back into the water, into the ocean. And the father said, "Don't you realize that there are miles and miles of beach and thousands of jellyfish, and you can't make a difference?" And the girl listens, and then she picks up another jellyfish and throws it back into the sea. And then she looks at her dad and she says, "I made a difference for that one." Not huge, but important nonetheless. No one show will change the world, but there are a lot of us show folk, and together we can make a solid dent in getting those jellyfish back into the sea. Thinking about meaning in life and that, and existential questions, then we can't get past Albert Camus. And he talked about the absurd. And when we butt up against the fact that we're going to die at some point, that being for sure one of the very few things we can be certain about, and that this will, when you look at it, it'll sort of render all of our daily undertakings meaningless. Then, when we've thought that thought, then we're smack bang in the middle of Albert Camus' absurd territory. Faced with the absurd situation of seeking meaning in an apparently meaningless universe, we can go one of two ways, or somewhere in between, the midway. We can fall into apathy and a mode of thinking that says, why would I ever do anything at all when, in the end, it won't matter? Why would I throw a jellyfish back when I can't throw them all in? Now, this can ultimately lead us to face Albert Camus' famous opening question from his book The Myth of Sisyphus. And I quote, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, that comes afterwards." So there you go. That's a bit of a punch in the face, isn't it? There are so many angles and reasons that makes life worth living. So I am not at that end of the spectrum. I have answered that question, and judging whether life is worth living or not, that I think it is. But arguments are made for the contrary by other philosophers in other places. But ultimately, Camus as well does lean towards choosing life, and he thinks that this is a rebellious act. The revolutionary human act is to wrest meaning from the absurd and meaningless by setting one's own rules. When we choose life for the richness it contains, we are immediately faced with what Camus calls all the rest, and which comes afterwards. That he just said, it's all the rest, what that comes afterwards. The world has 3 dimensions. For the starting point for this project that I have here is deeply personal, and that every one of us has a deeply personal project, which is yourself as a showman or as a human being. And it makes me thinking about all these things, it makes me take what I do and what I present to my audiences seriously. Because according to Camus, choosing life is to become the author of one's own meaning. And this is a rebellious act and one to be taken seriously. And Alan Watts said that if the universe is meaningless, so is the statement that it is so. If the universe is meaningless, then it doesn't mean anything to say that. The meaning and purpose of dancing is the dance, That was Alan Watts as well. If we are responsible for finding our own unique role in the universe, that sounds like a scary and impossible task, and often it is. This is why it's good to ask these fundamental questions sometimes, or read the works of those that have given these serious contemplation. We all sooner or later find ourselves in a situation where our mental state is not its usual fun self, and in these moments, when faced with the real death, your own or that of a loved one, depression, severe pain or illness, these supremely deep questions of life surfaces. Artists, writers, thinkers and academics are not immune to this kind of existential threat. Rather to the contrary, finding your way is of ultimate life and death importance, and knowing and feeling these aspects of meaning making I have talked about here isn't always enough. Sometimes we must seek professional help, but these things, thinking them, certainly for me, has made me more resilient. And really, as I see it, it's all about love. And in this sense, the story of the showman is a story of love. It's an expansion of the self to include the other. Like the showman has turned around to face the other, the others. Like how my daughter is part of me. We are separate, but a unit through love and shared biology for us too, but she is an expansion of myself. I feel real pain when she slips and falls on the ice whilst I'm teaching her to ice skate. I feel real happiness as well when she laughs, and I share in her joy when she is squirming at the garbage compactor scene in the original Star Wars movie. And by fully taking on that the audience is part of me, with no distinct boundary lines between them and myself, then I expand. My capacity to feel is increased. A microcosmic picture of this is how my character grew when I finally cracked the code that gave me access to presenting magic via the triangle eye gesture that we talked about a couple of episodes ago. That is a tiny expansion. The connection with the audience can, through many very simple small expansions, grow to include not just the audience before you in a particular show, or the combined audiences from all your performances, but all possible audiences. All of a sudden, we have expanded our connectivity to everyone. All of a sudden, I am a showman is to exclaim, I am humanity. Wow, that escalated quickly. Showman is the shape of the cog I am in the machinery that is mankind, or even life itself. This system places myself and all who identifies with the way of the showman into the greatest possible context. This is my note to self when I wake up lost in the dark night of the soul. Yeah, so how about them apples? I am showman, I am legend, I am humanity. That got really big, really quickly, I think. But for me, that thing is a subject worthy of a lot of contemplation and a lot of meditation. Just thinking about that when you stand before them and just really recognizing them as seeing yourself in a mirror. I mean, I'm out on a limb and just making this up, but yeah, I think that really changes your attitude towards them, and I'm going to have a whole chapter, a whole episode about this later on. Our attitude. We've got to always check our attitude. Anyway, it's been a pleasure talking to you again, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again in the next episode of this dramatic and exciting journey along the way of the showman. So with that, all that's left to say is you're excellent, and take care of yourself and those you love, and I really hope to see you along the way.